welcome to this final day of the Dietrich von Hildebrand Seminar on Personalism, the Personalist Vision. My name is Michael Matheson Miller. I'm on the board of the von Hildebrand Project. I'm a senior research fellow at the Acton Institute, and I'm delighted to be here as the moderator of this morning session with Professor Rocco Buttiglione and John Henry Crosby. So my job is quite easy because everyone I think on the call knows these two people. John Henry Crosby, of course, is the founder of the Dietrich von Hildebrand Project. I did write a 2,000-word iambic pentameter biography introduction of John Henry, but he told me I was not allowed to say it. So not even the rhyming couplet. But we all know John Henry, so delighted to have. And then Professor Buttiglione also needs no introduction to this group, but in case you do not know this book, if you have not read this book by Professor Buttiglione on the thought of Karol Wojtyła, as I was preparing for my talks, I took it out again, and it's just so wonderful. And if you want a good introduction to Wojtyła and you're sometimes struggling through person and community, this unintelligible work, or love and responsibility, or anything else, this is a great book. So I highly recommend it. Wojtyła, the thought of the man who became John Paul II. And I just also discovered, I didn't know this to my shame, but I was introduced to the thought of Augusto Del Noce at a conference where Professor Buttiglione and I were speaking, and read him, and he is such a wonderful thinker, and I just discovered that Professor Buttiglione was a student of Del Noce. So if you don't know Augusto Del Noce's work, Carlo Lancialotti is a physicist in New York. He translated the work of Del Noce into English. Wonderful thing. So delighted to have both of you on. I think the order is John Henry, you'll go first, and then Professor Buttiglione, and then we'll have some Q&A from the audience. So John Henry, why don't you begin?
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I'm very glad you didn't give the 2,000-word introduction, because as I said before, I think there would not have been 2,000 words worth of good things to say, and you would have probably had to tap into our distant history as fellow students together at Franciscan University. And so I'm glad we've left that where it belongs. But in all seriousness, it's actually a great pleasure to have you here, and thank you also for being a wonderful trustee of the Hildebrand Project. In fact, one of the very first and longest serving of the Hildebrand Project trustees. So the theme of this session is personalism and witness. And with this topic, I want to begin by underscoring how much I think we are moving into a sort of a specifically different or distinct dimension in our discussion of personalism. We've looked at personalist ideas. We've looked at the history of personalism, the antecedents of personalism. We've certainly looked at certain applications of personalism in psychology and in counseling, for example, or in education. But I think the opportunity to discuss witness, it would be a missed opportunity to sort of just look at it as another feature of personalism. It seems to me that witness is at the very heart of what makes personalism distinct, and what makes certainly the dimension of personalism that many people respond to, which is the respect in which it penetrates into human experience, is really captured most fully in the idea of witness. You may have noticed that the session has this description, many of the great personalist thinkers are great because they bore witness. And I think that's a further thought that I want to bring out throughout the comments here, which is to say that had a von Hildebrand or a Wojtyła written their philosophical and theological works, but somehow not borne witness in the ways that Rocco and I will try to show here, they would have been perhaps extraordinary thinkers, but would they have been witnesses in the sense of what we want to discuss today? I'm going to focus on von Hildebrand's witness during the anti-Nazi period because it's such an outstanding example and a memorable example of witness. But I thought I would begin just by reading a wonderful passage from Joseph Ratzinger in his foreword to The Soul of a Lion, which many of you know is the biography of von Hildebrand by his widow, Alice von Hildebrand, simply because it captures the witness in a broader dimension, which I think we don't want to lose sight of in von Hildebrand. So let me just read a few lines to you all here. He says, "I remember so well when as a young priest in the early 1950s, I was invited to a house owned by the von Hildebrand family, which lay within the boundaries of the parish to which I was assigned, to attend one of the conferences he was accustomed to give during his summer visits to Europe. Not surprisingly, his theme was beauty, and with great eloquence and enthusiasm, he spoke of its philosophical and spiritual importance. The joy and freshness of his understanding of Catholic doctrine was contagious and stood in marked contrast to the dryness of a kind of scholasticism that seemed then to have become stale and brittle. This is what I want to bring out here. Listening to him, one recognized that it was the transcendent beauty of truth that had captured his heart and his mind, a beauty he found expressed in its highest possible form in the living liturgy of the church. So this idea of a person's mind being captured by truth, I think that's wonderfully brought out by Joseph Ratzinger. So before I tell the story of von Hildebrand's witness, I just thought I'd begin with a kind of working definition of witness, and I offer this to you not in a philosophically or theologically comprehensive way, but more in the way that people will sometimes use a dictionary definition just to sort of get a kind of a working sense of the meaning of a word or a phrase. So this is taken from the New Catholic Encyclopedia. It's more specifically about Christian witness, but I think it's a good place to begin. So let me just read here. A witness is a person who calls attention to something other than himself, one who is called upon to give or to be evidence of something. He gives or is witness. All true religious witness is an exteriorization of inner commitment. It transmits truth to others in a living way. A witness is a person totally given to God and his fellow man. And the definition goes on, or the encyclopedia entry goes on to say that there are distinct hallmarks of Christian witness. One is a message that one is giving testimony to. A second is signs to convince. And then finally, divine help to awaken and draw others to God. So the life of grace. So with that kind of, I find that to be, not a perfect or comprehensive discussion of witness, but it captures some of the essential structure, I think, of witness, particularly this giving attention to something other than oneself and the exteriorization of inner commitment, as we saw in the Ratzinger passage. So I'm going to bring you all sort of in medias res right into some of the most dramatic moments in the Hildebrand period of resistance. I think you all know that he was one of the first and most outspoken Catholic intellectual opponents of Nazism and communism already in the 1920s and 1923. He was blacklisted for assassination, actually already in 1921. He had to flee in 1923 during the unsuccessful beer hall putsch, as it's known, an early attempt by Hitler to seize power. He had to flee to a neighboring German state. And he was, of course, able to come back. But that gives you some indication of how early he was detecting the evils of National Socialism. Then in 1933, there comes this pivotal moment when Hitler comes to power. And in January, February, and early March, von Hildebrand is watching this situation unfold in Germany. And he finally realizes that he needs to leave. And I want to underscore that though von Hildebrand did flee from Germany at the time, in the sense that he left because he knew he would end up in the concentration camp, the decision is more complex than that. And I thought I would just use the wonderful words of von Hildebrand himself to capture some of this. It's if witness is the interiorization of a truth in one person, then there's nothing like hearing it in the words of that individual. So from von Hildebrand's memoirs, for those of you who have My Battle Against Hitler, this is on page 52. He describes those crucial moments when the time to come has arrived. The time to leave has arrived, and he says, among other things, I simply could not make compromises, and it was clear to me that I was in the greatest danger of forfeiting my freedom. And then he says, it was clear to me that I could no longer teach in a National Socialist country because I was convinced that I would be forced to make compromises and that I would either have to keep silent about the injustices that would come or else risk the concentration camp. Better to be a beggar in freedom than to be forced into making compromises against my conscience. This was reason alone for my decision to leave Germany. And then he says, a few lines later, he says, "I think I can honestly say that I would have left Germany even without all of the peril of these various reasons. I had the conviction that this was right before God, and thus, despite all of the uncertainty of my future livelihood, I felt myself completely secure in the love of God. Deus providevit, God will provide." So there already you have some of the hallmarks of the Hildebrandian witness. Notice that it's not quite captured in this passage here, that one of the reasons that he felt he would compromise himself if he remained in Germany was that as a Catholic and a Catholic philosopher, he felt that he had an obligation to speak truth to power publicly and openly. He was quite clear that not everyone had that same duty, but he thought that as a philosopher, he had that duty. And so that speaks to a kind of public dimension of witness. Then, of course, he leaves Germany, and he goes first to Florence, the home of his birth, where he stayed with a sister and spends about 6 months discerning what he was to do. He had left Germany without any clear idea. He observes the young Austrian chancellor, Engelbert Dollfuss, and sees in him the only European head of state who has a kind of platform, a principled platform of opposition to Nazism. And it takes a good deal of time to finally meet with the chancellor. But when he finally is able to meet with him, he presents himself in the following way. He says, "I want to be an intellectual officer in the battle against National Socialism and communism." And the chancellor was impressed and offered to finance an anti-Nazi, anti-communist journal with the idea that it would become independent eventually, that Hildebrand was to edit. And so von Hildebrand spends the next 4.5 years in Vienna as the leader of this journal, and in one of the galvanizing figures in the intellectual and cultural resistance to National Socialism. This would be another thing to discuss, but this journal had the effect of bringing together many disparate figures in the resistance and giving them a platform. And I want to say a little bit about von Hildebrand's time in Vienna. The first thing that I think is just very, very touching, it actually happens just before he arrives in Vienna. He's still with his sister in Florence, but he receives a questionnaire from the University of Munich asking about essentially his Aryan status. Is he of sufficient Aryan blood, or is he a Jew? And von Hildebrand was fundamentally opposed to the nature of the question itself. He, under these dubious race laws, could have considered himself an Aryan. He had a maternal grandmother who was partially Jewish, so he didn't have enough Jewish blood to make him non-Aryan. But he was opposed to the question itself, and we found in the archives in Munich, it's very moving. It's just a simple word, but where he could indicate whether he is Aryan or non-Aryan. Are you Aryan? No, nein, written in big forceful letters. And I want to read again from the memoirs, just a passage, because it captures his heart in a special way. He says, "I did not want to supply evidence why, in spite of my Jewish grandmother, I could call myself an Aryan, for in this I saw myself as dealing with the Nazis, which I wanted to avoid at all costs. Finally, it was perhaps less dangerous for my sisters if I was dismissed for being non-Aryan. That shows that he always had a concern for others. Thus, I submitted the questionnaire, marking myself non-Aryan. I was proud at this moment to belong to the non-Aryans." And what I've always taken from this is not only the courage, but the solidarity that he was willing to establish with others, with, in this case, the particular victims of anti-Semitism. So I realized there would be so much more to say, and our time is running short. So I just want to read maybe 2 more passages from the memoirs. The one is a very interesting passage where he is warned by the head of the secret police in Vienna of the risk of assassination that he's running. And it's a very humorous description in the memoirs. He describes him as a Sherlock Holmes figure and a very kind of sort of suspicious type of person who asks him a lot of questions. Do you ever receive refugees in your home? And von Hildebrand says, of course, I receive them all the time. And he says, you can't do that because someone could come in disguise and kill you. Do you ever share a taxi with people? Well, of course I shared. Well, you can't do that anymore. Is your name on the door at your home? Well, of course it. Well, you can't do that anymore. And so he's warned that a plan is underway that's been detected by the Austrian police for his assassination. And he says, the chief of the secret police says, as soon as you notice anything, please notify me immediately. And finally, he said, it could be that they would be content to put out your eyes instead of killing you. I thanked him profusely for the warning. Naturally, it made a certain impression on me, but I cannot say that it even crossed my mind to withdraw, that is, to give up my political activities to avoid danger. Though I am fearful of physical dangers, I was not afraid. I was not intimidated by what the police chief said. I had the consciousness that I was conducting a struggle willed by God, and this gave me an incredible inner freedom. This theme of entrusting of himself to God's providence, the sense that that he might lose his life, but in the end gain everything, is a constant that we see in this wonderful account. Let me read just one last passage. He was often told that he was just unwilling to go along with the times, and that there was a lot of talk among Catholics in those days to give Nazism a Catholic turn and to try to sort of smooth the rough edges. And so he's confronted by a rather aggressive priest who thought it was completely outrageous that I did not want to accept God's will. National Socialism was now here in full swing. Vox temporis, vox Dei, the voice of the times, the voice of God. Like it or not, I had to accept that it was only a matter of time before National Socialism would come to Austria. To resist was both wrong and futile. So I wrote him a letter in which I briefly explained that God calls us to fight the Antichrist, regardless of whether we triumph, which ultimately is up to God. If God permits evil such as Bolshevism and National Socialism, then of course, as St. Paul says, it is to test us. It is precisely our struggle against evil that God wills, even when we suffer external defeat. So I think all of these passages speak for themselves. I offer them in the spirit of showing different moments, different aspects of the Hildebrand witness. One could certainly probe them more deeply. I think before turning it over to Rocco here, that it's worth saying that in Van Hildebrand's life, the witness that he gave took different forms. So during the Nazi period, it was this extraordinary courage, this willingness to make the ultimate sacrifices. He would certainly have been willing to go to the concentration camp or to suffer assassination. This doing that in the spirit of complete faith in the providence of God, all of that captures an extraordinary the kind of witness that really is only possible under these extraordinary circumstances. And at the same time, Van Hildebrand, even outside of the context of the battle against Nazism, was an extraordinary witness. I think we don't want to lose sight of the fact that the kind of witness he bore to his faith was enormously compelling to people. I want to back up and just say the witness in the fight against Nazism was in some respects under a particularly philosophical aspect. And I just would mention I've always thought this was sort of an extraordinary confirmation of the power of Van Hildebrand's witness. One of his students says that as the waves of Heidegger swept through Germany and won people for National Socialism, he says, Van Hildebrand inoculated us against the siren song of National Socialism. Anyone who understood Van Hildebrand felt no appeal on the part of Nazism. So this idea that while ideas remain in some sense abstract, they became immensely concrete, and they became a kind of protective armor for his students. But then I want to just leave with this idea that, of course, his witness extends far beyond the battle against National Socialism, and the witness of his faith was simply extraordinary. I unfortunately never had the chance to meet him, but he had over 100 godchildren. These were people who knew him as his students, knew him as attendees of his liturgical evenings, the salons that he gave in Munich and in Vienna, and people who read his books. I think it's, on the one hand, he was a wise person. People would come to him and he would explain difficult circumstances in their lives or how providence was working. I mean, again, Hildebrand, the philosopher, was never outside of the context of this witness. But at the same time, it seems to me that the extraordinary joy in his faith that he exuded. And I think we, in some sense, will never quite be able to experience that again. And Rocco will say this about John Paul II. It was in his facial expression. It was in the way in which he comported himself, the way in which he embraced his students. All of that, speaks to the respect in which transformation ultimately is a transformation not just of the mind, but of the heart and of the whole person. So that the whole person, simply in their mode of being in the world, bears witness. And I think in von Hildebrand, we see that in an extraordinary way. Von Hildebrand had this wonderful phrase, which I think you have in other spiritual writers as well, but he often spoke of the apostolate of being. This is the kind of thing you can't do just by being clever with arguments. The apostolate of being is what happens to a person once they have totally interiorized and their commitments, and perhaps in the Hildebrandian sense, even beyond that, not only the work of their own freedom, their own ability to make their commitments, but of course, ultimately, the being transformed in Christ. That was the great hallmark of von Hildebrand's witness. So I'll leave it there, and now we turn to the other great witness, John Paul II. So thank you.
Thank you, John Henry. That was a beautiful talk. Very well done. Thank you very much. So, Professor Buttiglione, if you could please give us your presentation on Wojtyła as a witness, and that you were friends with him, you knew him very well, and I think as a growing up, I know for me, of course, he became Pope when I was in 6th grade. And I remember getting this picture and having it on my like lamp in my desk of Wojtyła, and there was this attraction to him. When he died, I wrote a piece for Catholic World Report on the canonization, and I said, I never met him, but I'd listened to him, and I said that he inspired us to moral goodness. He inspired us to purity. He inspired us to a vision, and his famous line of like, don't be satisfied with mediocrity. I unfortunately am too satisfied with it, but anyway, we can talk about that later. But the way I articulated it was that from that line in the Gospel of John, like how God loved us first, that he loved us first. And in that response to his love, I think young people were deeply moved by him. So if you could give us your experience of your personal witness, of his witness, please.
There is a book edited by Tadeusz Stitchen that has as title The Witnesses of the Witness, and it contains some memories of the friends of Wojtyła. Listening to the magnificent exposition of John Henry, two sentences came to my mind. One is of Don Giussani. Once Don Giussani said that within the experience of a great love, whatever you do is attracted within this experience. It acquires its meaning through the relation to this experience, the experience of a great love. And this fits very well with Wojtyła. Wojtyła was a man who was living a great love. It is expressed in his motto, totus tuus, I am completely yours. Yours of whom? The sentence comes from a French author of spirituality, a saint, Grignon de Montfort. It means I completely belong to Jesus through Mary, or I completely belong to Mary who leads me to Jesus. You can read it both in both ways. And he once said, those who have the true fear of God are not afraid of man. And the fear of God is not really fear. It's the wonder at the majesty of God, at the presence of God in our lives. And Wojtyła was a man who lived the presence of God in his life. He lived the presence of God in his life, first of all, as a priest in the celebration of the Holy Mass. All those who have been present to a Mass said by Wojtyła remember how much he was present in what he was doing, how completely he was present in what he was doing, and how completely identified with the sacrifice of Jesus for all men. That was the beginning. But then there was a second stage, and that was the capacity of entering into the life of others, of seeing others with the same eye with which God sees them. And Wojtyła could see in his friends a vocation. He could listen to the word of God being spoken in the life of his friends. And his friends were so many. If you go to Krakow, you will find a lot of people who will tell you, I was an intimate friend of Wojtyła. Well, perhaps now no more, many of them are dead. But really, he was the best friend of so many people. Tendentially, he was the best friend of all the people of the Diocese of Krakow and of Poland and of the world. He was the friend of the whole world. And to give witness means to him meant to enter into the life of others and to revive in them the conviction of their transcendent dignity. No life, Michael, you quoted it before, no life is banal. In the life of each human being, there is a tremendous tragedy. It is a drama in which God is looking for your alliance in order to save the world. And in each human life, the destiny of the world is contained and is decided somehow. And you may become one who, together with Jesus, saves the world, or you can refuse this. So the relation to God and the relation to the other, any human being, and a tremendous conviction that all human beings are called, even the enemies. I remember the years of Solidarność. They were terrible years in front of the sheer violence of the communist government, the communist dictatorship. Well, even before, but in those years in a particular way. And what was the main issue present to John Paul II? We must tell the truth. We must remain faithful to the truth, and we must tell the truth. To tell the truth is a duty to the oppressors, because it is an appeal to their conscience in order that they may recover their dignity that they are destroying. The violence of the regime is not only a sin against the people, it's also a sin against those who exercise violence themselves. So how can we find a way of resisting oppression, of telling the truth in front of the oppressors without offending their human dignity, without making use of violence? How not to bow in front of violence and at the same time not to make use of violence? In his message for the 13th day, it was the 13th Peace Day, he said that violence needs lies, needs falsity. In order to exercise violence, you must be convinced one way or another, or you must have the pretension of being convinced at least, that the other is threatening you. Then we do not threaten you, we do not challenge you in the field of power, but we cannot help telling you the truth. And the truth is that you are wrong. I remember a small episode. It is not directly related to Wojtyła, but it gives you the idea of what it was to live within the sphere of influence of his personality, because it corresponded very much to his thought. There was a great novelist, Ivaskiewicz, who was very popular among the young people. He had given some signs of opposition to the regime, and many looked at him for spiritual guidance, and he betrayed. He signed the act of submission to the regime, to Jaruzelski. And in a similar case in Italy, we had a similar man, it was Giovanni Gentile, and the resistance shot him down. He was killed. We did not kill Ivaskiewicz, but one day Ivaskiewicz opened the door of his home and he found a wall made up with all his books that his readers had brought him back in order to show him that they could not accept what he had done, that what he had done was wrong. The history of the life of Wojtyła is made up of so many similar cases. Let us find a way of making it clear that we do not accept violence, and nevertheless, we do not challenge our opponent in the field of force, of violence. Another example, this was led in one sense directly from Wojtyła. There was a new city, the regime had built a new city, Nova Huta, the new workshop, we could translate, and in the periphery of Krakow. And this had to be the city of the new man, of the new communist man who lived without God. And since this new man had no God, he did not need any church. And Wojtyła bought a small piece of land in Nova Huta to build a church. And he was not allowed to build the church. And the workers who began to build the church were disbanded. And then one day, the women of Krakow went there to defend the workers who wanted to build the church. And the secret police, they were communists, but they were Polish men, did not dare making violence to the women. And in the end, the church was built. It was built without the building materials that were not given by the regime. It was built with the stones gathered in the Wisla, in the river of Krakow. The young people spent their vacationing time taking the stones in the river and bringing them to the building place in order that they could be used to build the church. And in the end, the church was built, and everybody who goes to Poland, who goes to Krakow, can see this church. It was not only a church made of stones, it was a church made through the love of the people, the love to their faith, to their history, to their nation, and also to those who wanted to destroy their nation and destroy their faith and destroy their love. It comes to my mind now, as what regards the nation, von Hildebrand, in his magazine edited in Vienna, developed a very interesting philosophy of the German nation, because he loved his nation and he was proud of being a German. And he explains that there are two paths open to the German nation, but we could say two paths open to any nation, but in this particular case, it was the German nation. One path is Germany for itself and against the world, to put the strength, the power, the force of Germany in the service of the self-affirmation. And this was exemplified by Hitler. And the other, it was, we could say, the Prussian way of the German nation. And the other was the Austrian way, because Austria is Germany, but it's not Germany. It is the same culture, but it is not quite the same culture. And the Austrian way was Germany in the service of Europe, in the service of, in a peaceful dialogue with other nations, and in the service of a true human community encompassing all of mankind. This was the Austrian principle, or perhaps also the Habsburg principle, because not in reality, but at least in the myth, in the Austrian myth, the Habsburg monarchy grew not through the use of force, but bringing together different nations. There is a motto, you know it, John Henry, your mother must have taught you, Ali gerant bella, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage wars. You, happy Austria, get married. But in the origin, it had a particular meaning that we cannot explain now. But in the Austrian myth, it acquired a particular meaning. You put together different nations, the Croatians, the Slovenians, the Czechs, also a part of the Polish men, who gather together, entering into kind of a marriage to one another, because they recognize a transcendent truth that lives in each one of these nations. And together, they can better affirm this truth. The last emperor of the Habsburgs was Karl. He became a blessed because in the end of the Habsburg monarchy, he tried to revive this original spirit, transforming the monarchy from the dominion of one nation over other, or two nations over other nations, into a family of nations. And this idea, and Karol Wojtyła was named Karol because his father felt a deep loyalty to the last emperor, to the peace message of the last emperor. So to be a witness means to live a great love. Love to God, love to man. And if you live this love, you do not call to yourself. The witness does not bring witness to himself. It brings witness to somebody else, to God through Mary. But you cannot give witness to God being alone. You must be in a community. This community is the nation, yes, but it is also the small group of friends who are around you and who constitute the first manifestation of the communal personality that you are, that you have. And so he had many friends, and he gathered his friends around him. In Poland, they called it with a particular way. It was the way the word środowisko. Środowisko means the environment, those who are around. They are not all the friends, first ones, and other friends may become friends through these friends who talked to him about their friends, and they had a passionate interest in the life of other people whom he had never known. I entered into the group of his friends much time before I saw him personally, because my friends, his friends who had met me, told him about me and told me about him. And well, and this is the church. The church, the church in the sense that the communion becomes a community. And I should stop because time is running. That was him. You could see him when he spoke to anybody whom he met the first time, but you could see him in the most pregnant way when he was in prayer in the Mass. Here, he was really himself, and he gave witness to the one, Jesus, who made of him what he was, from whom he received his being every moment of his life.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I apologize. I had a little technical difficulty in the middle. So I'm on a different phone, but I was able to hear all of that. And it was a very beautiful, presentation of the witness. A couple of things stand out to me from both of you. And feel free to correct if I'm misrepresenting. But one is almost let's say a tripartite witness. The first, that witness that they both are in deep friendship with Jesus Christ, and this confidence of their own calling, not just the political calling and all the great things they did in their resistance, but just their calling, that they had this divine filiation, that they were a son of the living God. And that led them to, I think, as you said beautifully, Professor Buttiglione, to enter into the life of others and revive the conviction of this transcendent calling in another, that there was an intersubjectivity in the witness, this personalist element. And then those two things, about first their friendship with Jesus Christ, their deep realization of the unique unrepeatability of each person, led them to have the conviction and the confidence to live that out under duress, where they could then speak to the political questions. So I don't know if that fits, but that struck me about both of them, and that leads me to my first question. And so the first question is that I have, and then I'm going to get to the questions. And I have to make one technical apology. I had a great setup here with my computer. I could see everything, and it was easy to moderate. And I was so excited during Professor Buttiglione's lecture. I went to tell my wife to come listen, and when I did, I kicked my computer over and broke it. So I have to use my phone now. So there we have it. I feel like I have fully become a philosopher to do something so silly. All right. So, so I apologize if I'm going to go in and out here with looking at the questions. But so my first question today is, this talk by both of you seems to be very relevant to the West today, to the United States and to Europe. We, I think, and feel free to disagree with me here, are in an anthropological struggle about what it means to be a human person. And we just finished the month of June, which is Pride Month, which was an affirmation of this plastic anthropology, against which Wojtyła in '68, had already worked on in Love and Responsibility against von Hildebrand, and that it's an anthropological view, but it's phrased as something loving and caring. And we have to be able to tell the truth about the human person, because if we don't tell the truth, we're acting with injustice, and the weakest and the poorest, the most vulnerable, get hurt. And so we're in a bit of a different situation where to tell the truth seems to be hateful, but to not tell the truth is to not be loving and to be unjust, because we in a sense promote lies about the nature of the person and thereby encourage injustice, I would say. How do you react to that? What do you think about this, and why? Or do you think that's right? Do you think that's wrong? And what does Wojtyła and von Hildebrand have to say to us about that?
Rocco, would you like to say something first about Wojtyła?
Well, I think there is really nothing new. It was exactly the same problem that Wojtyła had with the communists all his life through. No, not all his life through. In the last part of his life, the communists were no more there. How can we tell the truth, showing at the same time love to the person? It is not easy, and very time it will not be accepted. You must tell the truth, and at the same time you must accompany the truth that you say with the evidence of the love that you have to others. And here the question becomes more complicated, because there are many different levels of communication. In the individual level, I would say, Wojtyła would say, you must say the truth with authority. It is not just a matter of giving arguments. Well, we are very, very apt at giving arguments. We are professional philosophers. But seldom people are convinced through the arguments of a professional philosopher. You can humiliate your opponent, you can. I did sometimes, I should not have done it, but I confess I did it sometimes. But that's not the way. A word spoken with authority is a word in which the other first recognizes that you really love him. Imagine that I am convinced that homosexuality is wrong. Imagine that I go to an homosexual and tell him, what you are doing is wrong. I love you, but what you are doing is wrong. He's likely to be offended. And sometimes I did, and I was invited to mind my business. Sometimes I did, and I wasn't invited to do my business. It was when the person to whom I spoke already knew that I really loved him because he had been his friend, really his friend, in difficult circumstances of life. Sometimes you must wait a lot of time before you can say a word with authority. Sometimes you must wait your whole life. But nevertheless, time comes. And if you have given witness to love, then you can give witness to truth, and this truth will be listened to. We must always keep united the witness given to truth to the witness given to love. Veritatem facientes in caritate. Making truth, facientes does not mean telling, it means to make. Create truth as a personal experience for the other through the witness of love. I think this would be the answer of 51. At the public level, this has some additional complications, and we can discuss them later, perhaps.
No, thank you. Yeah, I mean, you've had this problem at the public level, right? Where this speaking of the truth caused you difficulty. I would say just really quickly, one thing that struck me, I remember I have this experience, and I want John Henry to get this. I remember once I was living in Europe, and there's a man who was struggling with homosexual tendencies, and he asked me a question. He wanted to be a Catholic, and I said, "Are you asking me, can you be a Catholic and have these tendencies?" And so we went through, and in simple terms, I was very direct, but very clear about what the church taught. And I went through, and I didn't invent anything. It was just an Orthodox teaching. He was so excited that I told him that, and it struck me from that time on. If you can tell the truth and do it in a way, as you said, Professor, we're sometimes afraid, but it's exactly what the person is looking for, because we're just in such a culture, like Solzhenitsyn says, we're in a culture of lies. So I think that's beautifully said. John Henry, do you have a comment on my first question?
Well, yeah, I was, the thing that came to mind was, of course, that in the anti-Nazi period, if you read von Hildebrand's essays, I mean, there's a way in which he really, speaks in a kind of prophetic voice. I mean, there's a certain thundering, against the evils of National Socialism. And I think it's important to know that while this was both characteristic of him, this kind of prophetic way of speaking, that he was not, it's not as if this was the sum total of his way of essentially giving witness to the truth, particularly with people individually. There are wonderful stories that Alice von Hildebrand tells of people who, including homosexuals, who came to him because of his particular tenderness towards them, and his understanding and his willingness to go out of his way to support them. And of course, this would have been at a time when there was anyways more, let's assume for a moment that it might have been more difficult to be a homosexual for certain reasons, in earlier times. But Hildebrand was not, he didn't recoil from the people in question. He went to great lengths to try to use the language of accompaniment to walk with them. So I think that there are these different modes that Rocco describes, and there is a lot of what von Hildebrand was doing in Vienna was meant as a kind of public witness to truth and an effort to change hearts and minds. In the mission statement of his journal, he wrote that he says at a time of great ferment and confusion, when certain errors are being abandoned because they have been proved to be unlivable. That's a confusing thought, but for another time. He says, we have to present clearly the eternal, universally valid ideas of state, nation, people, right and wrong, authority, freedom, personality. In other words, there's a kind of moment in which he hoped to still shore up certain ideas and certain institutions. But I think it's very important to know that, to recognize the other sort of tones of voice in which von Hildebrand could speak to people, particularly in the one-on-one. I think again, I didn't know him in that context, but from everything I know, it was very moving, very warm, full of interest in the other. This idea of entering into the life of the other that Rocco has described was vintage Hildebrand. You know, he didn't just have 100 godchildren because people said, you know, I read a book, would you be my godfather? He was always somehow involved in their lives and a friend to them.
Great, thank you. So we have just a couple of minutes left. So I'm going to try to do a speed round. Now, if there's someone who's not good at doing speed rounds, it's me. But I'm going to be trying to be disciplined for both of you to do speed rounds. So I'm going to try to get to a couple of the questions. One question, very quickly, Professor Buttiglione, one person asked, why is Giovanni Gentile a model? That was the question they asked. Could you just very quickly expand on that? And then I'll get to the next question.
Well, I should give you a course on Italian philosophy, which I cannot. He was a very distinguished philosopher. And he was a fascist, but within fascism, he had been a point of reference for many who wanted to go beyond fascism. And so he had a great prestige, and many of those who participated in the resistance against the Germans, the Nazis, better, had been his disciples. So he was quite an interesting man. May I say one word on, again, on the other issue? I think we must all be convinced that we are sinners. If you speak to somebody pretending, I am upright, and you are a sinner, this is the wrong start. Wojtyła was very convinced of this. The perception of your own sinfulness is the beginning of salvation. And from this perception, you can tell the truth in front of anybody without pride. And pride is the main obstacle for others. Your pride is the main obstacle to others to accept and receive truth.
That's beautiful. No, I think it's very important. Second question. One questioner asks that maybe the person doesn't work so much as a getting people dignity. Dignity is not sufficient enough, but there's maybe an idea of the common good. So very quickly, what do you think that Wojtyła or von Hildebrand would say what do you think would appeal to a broad group of people about what the common good is? How would both of them articulate that? And this is a speed round. You got to go quickly. I know it's a big question, but I mean, you have like 5 seconds each.
All right. The common good is not the sum of the individual goods. The common good begins when I love you and I cannot determine my good without encompassing in my personal good your good. I cannot think of my good without encompassing the good of my wife. And this means that I don't know what I want until I know what my wife wants. This does not mean that I always do what my wife wants, but she is an interior, is interior to me. The capacity of seeing the other as a part of me in my interiority is a constituent part of the idea of common good. By the way, the books of Scheller on sympathy and of Edith Stein on empathy, well, they give you, and so they were not political philosophers. Well, Scheller was, but not in this book. They give you an inroad into the true concept of common good.
Beautiful. Joe Henry?
I'm going to let you ask another question if you still have one.
Okay.
With 1 minute left.
I do. And so maybe one last question very quickly. Again, sorry, this is again to Professor Buttiglione. One of the questions was, you said you have to speak with authority. And the question is, what do you mean by authority? What does authority mean?
Well, authority etymologically means, comes from the verb augeo. I make something grow. The word of authority is the word that helps to grow. And there are many ways of gaining authority, but the most decisive one is the authority of love. People believe to those who love them. Let me quote Dante, amor che a nullo amato amar perdona, amor that does not allow any beloved not to love. Sometimes we understand the omnipotence of God as the omnipotence of the king. No, it is the omnipotence of the lover. God has chosen, in one sense, to set aside the omnipotence of the king, at least for a time, and to enter into our lives through the omnipotence of love.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, I think there's a lovely, I think in the Jewish tradition, this idea as well of God, and that love, I think, is very beautiful and biblical. So what I would like to say, John Henry, that we should have every year at the von Hildebrand session a speed round with Professor Buttiglione, because I made him focus. And I mean, talk about beautiful answers at the end. I was just taking notes. That was really, really beautiful. And we're getting people texting in saying how beautiful that was. So thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Buttiglione. Thank you, John Henry. What a wonderful witness to the witness of personalism. Thank you again for joining everyone. And we have our next session coming up soon. And it was a delight to be with you all.